Hey everyone, my name is John Chapman. I'm the Director of Business Development here at Pivt, and I'm joined by our COO, Chris Roberts. We're here to talk today about the business value of supporting your employees' social well-being, particularly through relocation, but also more generally. I think something that I hear a lot when I speak to clients in the market is something we've learned over the past 2 years, and what we'll be taking in the with us in the future will be, what happens outside of work, your community, your family, your social life overall directly impacts your well-being at work and your productivity overall. So we're going to be taking you through some of that, what we're doing here at Pivt to address some of those issues. And then we'll close up with a short demo and a question and answer session. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Chris to start really with, can you tell us a little bit about the importance of social well-being? How does it impact companies' bottom line? Why should we care about this?
Sure. And hello, everybody. It's nice to be with you, and thanks for joining us as we talk through this. So to answer your question, John, I think it's important to start with thinking about the retention issue that I would say many businesses are facing today. And while the challenge may vary widely from company to company, I think one thing's very clear, and that is that the retention issue is a costly issue when you think about company bottom line. I saw recently that there's a couple of studies that are actually pegging the cost of losing somebody to somewhere around 6 to 9 months of their salary.
Wow.
And when you look at whether it's that specific number or you look at other retention cost numbers, most of the time they're only factoring in recruiting and training costs to those churn numbers, when in reality you also have costs to the business objectives that person in that role are contributing to meeting. You've got impacts to other things as well, like company branding, that sometimes are a little bit harder to quantify. And then depending upon, your company work situation right now, you could also have real estate costs, you could have relocation costs. And so the numbers here that we're talking about can get quite steep quite quickly. So then when you think about the correlation that this has to social well-being, it's really important to understand, and there's a lot of studies out there specifically around job embeddedness that highlight how important social well-being is. And one example is just thinking about the role that community plays in our role as employees. There's a lot of studies out there that point to the more likely you are to have a community that you belong to. And that could be a church community, that could be volunteers, that could just be a group of friends. It could be coworkers, it could be a combination of all of those. The more you have something like that and you belong to that, the more likely you are to stay at your job. And so when we take that and we think about where we've been in this pandemic, in the social isolation that all of us have faced, and then you also look at it in other areas too, like in corporate relocation, there's all these pockets where that connection to community has really been disrupted. And so as businesses, we really have to make sure that we're thinking about this as a part of our overall retention strategy.
That makes a lot of sense, Chris. And I think we're both in the mobility industry here at Pivt. And so I think a lot of our listeners here are today. So specific to mobility, I guess, why should we care? Why is this important? It seems like this is a broader problem as well.
It is. It is. So is earbuds with cords. But the challenge when you look at mobility is that there's a lot of studies that have looked at this. Some of the ones that we've looked at have pointed to upwards of a third of people who have relocated within a company's program are likely to leave due to social isolation. So that can be a big number when we know that an average program, when a company has a program, an average program is going to likely have hundreds of people, upwards to thousands of people. So if you take a third of that population and you wipe them out because of social isolation, social acclimation issues, that's a problem, right? And then this is further compounded again, thanks to the pandemic. But this is sort of I would say more of a positive thing in that so many people have newfound flexibility in where they can live and where they can work. And that's also spurring a whole lot of relocation there in and of itself. So I think we also have to factor in that community of people. We have a number that we looked at that just in the US that there's approximately 23 million people who moved in that scenario last year alone. That's wow. Crazy. And wow. and certainly I think impacts the workforce, even though I don't think there's enough focus on that just yet and understanding, what the real impact is.
Wow. Yeah, that's a huge number, and it just goes to show the opportunity there is for the mobility industry to support folks who are just moving because they can, but obviously those corporate sponsored relocations as well. I think about myself and my own experience moving from New York to Chicago recently, and there are things in my life that I'm still looking for, having been there for 6 months. A dentist, which I probably shouldn't admit on this webinar. Vets, a soccer league. Is social well-being in supporting that really just for international transfers, or is this also important for intra-country moves too?
It's definitely both. I mean, I think a lot of people can easily recognize without living the experience that it's a need for expats. I mean, if you just simply think about language barriers, cultural differences, I mean, those things immediately you can say, okay, there's definitely some gaps and hurdles there that can be overcome. But there's also so many things that tie to both an expat or a domestic mover, like some of the items that you mentioned. Another interesting one is food. When you think about food and buying groceries or going to certain kinds of restaurants, those are a big part of people's lives. And when that's disrupted, that can create a whole lot of challenges for an individual and a family. But when you also then look at the community side, which we're hyper focused on, that community can be disrupted. I mean, we had a really great one of my favorite interviews that we did in all the research that we've done was a lady telling us about how important it was for her to find a Jewish community center in her new city because her family was so tied into that. And she moved from New York down to Texas. And when she moved into the area in Texas, she realized that there actually wasn't one of those communities. And so it kind of created this moment of, okay, who do we belong to now? And that's just one example of, I think, probably, I don't know, hundreds of other conversations that we've had in which we've heard similar things like that, where community is disrupted. And I think one other really important area is, when we think about even just all of the politics and all of the divisive things that we've been trying to sort through as a country here in the US, and certainly I'm sure we're not alone in that, that's also caused people to rethink what communities they belong to. Why do they belong to them? Causing them to be maybe a little bit more judicious in what are the shared goals or the things that bring me together versus separate me, and creating all these new questions in people's minds
Mhm.
that I think we have a real opportunity to help people to navigate and to sort through. And that's certainly going to come in play in domestic scenarios, right? And so it's definitely a challenge for both communities of people.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And something I was thinking about as you were noting that this isn't a short-term problem when it comes to a relocation, right?
Right.
Building a community, it takes a while. Finding your tribe. Even if you're starting from scratch in that example you used, moving from New York to Texas and not having that community. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How you really need that support for a longer period of time than just a couple of weeks.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about the role that a community plays in our lives, I mean, it can impact all kinds of things. And so, one example is that I think stands out in my mind is the impact that a school has on a family's life. So, where your kids go to school is a really important thing for a lot of factors. We could probably spend a whole webinar on that alone.
Yeah.
But we've heard things like, the proximity to the school is a challenge. And so if you aren't close by that school, especially when you're new to the area, that can severely limit you in the interactions that you have with people. If you're seeing other things that I think are kind of interesting things too to note on that same topic, we've seen parents that recognize that their children are acclimating and getting integrated in the community really quickly thanks to their school, where then the parent is there feeling like they're left in the dust because they're having to keep their house going. They're having to try to provide for the needs of their family and taking on this new role. Or maybe if you're the spouse to the person that moved, or the partner, right, you might be having to reinvent yourself and reinvent your career. And so trying to do all of that while also trying to build a community, it's almost like it's like this impossible task for
Right.
people. So to be able to come in and help guide somebody through that, I think is a really important role to have. And we use the example of school. There's probably a myriad of other ones that we could talk through as well. But it's definitely a growing challenge, again, especially when we see more and more people that are moving on their own. But even corporate relocation, in many ways, has not really slowed down, and we're seeing lots of indicators that we may be back up to 2019 numbers this year. So things are happening.
Yeah. And, Chris, you touched on something interesting in that response. So I'm going to run with that for a second. You mentioned the spouse, and, I think we're really trying to frame the issue here. And, social well-being, that community that your employees have outside of work directly impacts their productivity, your company's bottom line. What about their partner or their spouse? Or, I think, and I don't like this phrase, but in the mobility industry, we've used trailing spouse often. How does their social well-being affect your employees and ultimately their productivity at work?
It has a huge impact. And I've been fortunate to be in this industry for almost 5 years now. And one of the things that's always surprised me is how for years and years and years, it's been very widely known that spouses are under supported in the overall process. And that can have really big implications on the family. So we know that there's a lot of high divorce rates connected to relocation,
Wow.
because you're putting lots of stress and strain on that relationship to begin with whenever you move. I mean, anybody who's moved and you've moved with a spouse or partner, there's stress on your relationship. You further complicate that by a longer distance move, a move that might be going into a completely different culture. That's going to only make it even more complicated. And then you layer on the fact that while you all may have agreed to it, all of the support is largely on your partner, right? And you're just kind of left there to try to sort your own self out, and in many respects deal with the personal needs of your family situation. And so that puts those people very often in a place where they are isolated just due to the responsibilities they have, but they're also isolated in a career standpoint, and also that personal community and friendship and social standpoint as well. So we see that as a really important community for us to be able to help and to make sure that they have resources, make sure that they have people that can empathize with them and help them say, yeah, I've been there before, and here's what I did to be successful. Here's how I helped, make sure that my relationship was successful. Here's and even, I'll hit pause for a second before I go down that path any further, but just to say that one of the things that we've recognized is that spouses and partners in this situation oftentimes aren't even aligned in what their goals are in that move. And so as a company, that's one of the things that we're trying to do. And sometimes it's just simply getting those people to talk to one another.
Yeah.
Or getting them to realize, like, oh yeah, this person's really cares about this one thing and they're talking about it a lot. You might want to think about, having a conversation yourselves. So it's an underserved community that plays a very critical role, because I joke a lot of times about how in our family, if my wife, and really joke, but I've said this before, where if my wife gets sick, I feel like our house falls apart. Even though I contribute a lot to our everyday, she still plays a central role in what we do. And so I think it's the same thing in a relocation.
Yeah.
If your spouse or your partner is struggling, it's going to affect everybody.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Now that makes a ton of sense, and I think that's a good segue as well into what we're doing here at Pivt in terms of our vision of the future. What we're doing right now as well with our March 1st launch across the U.S. And then I do want to jump in and just note, for those of you in the comments listening, feel free to jump in with questions. We'll try and address them as they come through. And then obviously we can have a short question and answer session after we're done here as well. So, feel free to comment as we go through this. But, moving in I guess, pivoting to Pivt, these are really interesting and big problems in relocation, more broadly when you're looking at a flexible work environment. What is Pivt doing to address these problems? Like how are we going about solving this for our clients?
There's a lot of ways that we can go about this. And I touched on a couple of them in some of the previous answers, but I would say it all centers and it all starts with building community. We are first and foremost a community builder for people on the move. And everything that we do is always going to come back to that. And so while there may be opportunities for us to drive you to other resources that could help you along the way, it's only going to be done in a way that is going to help continue to foster and grow that community of people that can support you. When you think about that approach of community, we also take, I would say, a little bit of a different approach than a lot of social media platforms would, and that being that we have a pretty strong conviction that for people to be successful in a relocation and to be building that community, it has to be both digital and in person. And so our focus is always going to be about helping to build that community in a digital setting first and foremost, but looking for the ways that we can help bridge that gap between that digital community and the in-person. And that could be through things like events. It could be through things like where we might say, hey, John and Chris, you have these similarities and you might want to go get coffee sometime. You can also be looking at things like being a little bit more aggressive too with just making introductions to the right people. We had a really interesting conversation early on in trying to decide that where do we go as a company as we continue down this path. And we've very much taken this perspective of, when we think about the role that Pivt can have, we want Pivt to be sort of like that vivacious connector that you are lucky to go to a networking event with. That person that they know a little bit about you, they know a little bit about a bunch of other people, and they're super excited and passionate about making those connections. And so that person that like grabs you by the arm and like drags you over to meet 3 other people over here.
Yep.
And they're the one that says, hey, you guys need to all talk and make it happen and see ya, right? And then they leave the scene. And so we want to operate in a kind of a similar mindset of really helping to make those connections, helping to make those quick intros, get people talking, and finding those right moments of interaction for them.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And, Jack had a question in the comments, which I want to address briefly before we move on, because I do think it speaks to, some of the issues that we were framing earlier and also what we're doing here at Pivt. So, the mobility, component extends for a certain period of time and then, for the most part ends. But employee social well-being, their overall well-being, those needs continue. So are we working with organizations beyond the scope of mobility to address this?
We are, and 2 very clear examples in my mind are the first being this really cool company called Limitless Minds, who really focuses on helping to cultivate effective leadership mindset that really challenges people to take their game from where it is today and really elevate it. And so they've got a lot of really cool concepts like neutral thinking that they've really baked into a program that they're actively out there using to help individuals and organizations to continue to expand and grow and develop. So we're working with partners like that. And then we're also working with, actually, so there's 3. So then we're also working with people like life coaches, as an example. When you look at the community of people that have moved, it's incredible how many life coaches are out there. Yeah. And a lot of it centers on the fact that when you go through a longer distance move, there's almost sort of like this like PTSD. And I don't mean to necessarily diminish that for people that really go through it in more traditional senses, but there is sort of this shared trauma that you go through in a relocation. And what we found is very often that converts people to want to then help others. And so we've seen a lot of people who have then gone into roles in relocation specifically, or into these kind of life coaching roles. And so we're looking at those folks as being people who can help us provide content and growth along the way. Jack, the other one, which you would be a little bit more familiar with as well, is also looking for opportunities to partner with service providers like a destination service consulting company to potentially extend the life cycle of what they're doing, right? A lot of times the services that are out there to support people are time boxed to a very small window of time. And sometimes it might be only like 60 days into their settling in. So much of life happens beyond 60 days. And so we're looking for ways to be able to incorporate them into what we're doing, to be able to help leverage the value that they bring in a longer term sense as well.
Yeah. And one thing to add to that before we move on, part of what we're doing here at Pivt is, an annual subscription. And so I think, to your point, Jack, we are acknowledging that, yes, getting from point A to point B, there is a set time limit there, but building that community, finding that trusted local information, finally settling in, that is an ongoing process that takes, months, if not years. And so that's something that we are trying to address here, just in terms of the scope of the length of our service and what we're doing here at Pivt. Chris, I wanted to move on to something that I think some of our audience, may have heard before, and so want to clarify a little bit. Initially when we were launching Pivt, we had looked at other social media platforms, other organizations in mobility, and had decided to take a city by city approach. Now we realized that wasn't going to work for various reasons. So we decided and have made some changes to the application and are launching across all of the US on March 1st. how are we doing that? What changes did we do, take operationally within the application to make sure that we're delivering value wherever what your assignees are going inside the United States?
Sure. I would say a lot of it centers on mindset.
Yeah.
And so when we initially launched Pivt, we were in New York and in London. We were a consumer app at the time, had about 10,000 people in the app. And at the time we were trying to help cultivate conversations that were very much focused on the local setting. And even when we relaunched as an enterprise application in Dallas this past year, it was still very much the same kind of an approach, but just on an enterprise level. But as we were paying attention to how people were interacting, and at the same time doing literally, I think it was several hundred or a lot of research interviews with people that have moved both through corporate relocation as well as on their own, what we found is that so many of the conversations and the needs that people had are much broader than just the local level. And so we talk about things like, how do I manage my mindset across the highs and the lows of relocation? How do we help people just get into the mindset of thinking like a local? How do we help people with re-socializing themselves essentially in a new place? These kinds of things really, it doesn't matter if you're talking to somebody, right down the street from you or somebody in a completely different country. You can have that conversation with somebody regardless of the physical place. And so we saw that as a huge opportunity to open up a much broader conversation for people. And then that also gives us the ability to also start to go down the path of local experts that can help us both look at local and broader needs that people have and helping to deliver content. So that way, if you're somebody who's, moving to the middle of nowhere in West Texas, or you're moving to New York or, somewhere in between, you're going to be able to find something on our application that's going to be able to be of value to you. You're going to be able to connect to people who can provide value to you.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And, tied to that mindset is that management of expectations, right? Moving is going to be stressful regardless, but, making sure that your expectations are aligned with reality and along with your spouse, partner, family, the company. I think that's a big piece of what we're doing here. Now, we obviously are playing in a sandbox at Pivt of a lot of other, mobility services. There's relocation management companies, there's destination service providers, and sort of everything in between. So, I do want to take some time to clarify for those of you who I haven't spoken to or Chris hasn't spoken to and haven't gotten some of these details. What are we exactly? We're definitely not a destination service provider. We're not a relocation management company. Can you really take us through how we complement a lot of those services?
Sure. And I would say it's, I think the one thing that we usually get tied to either one of two groups. And I would say the first one would be destination service providers. So we aren't a destination service provider, although the community aspect of what we're doing, as well as some of the potential resources that we might direct you to, could have overlap. Again, our goal at the, from the onset and throughout anything that we do is building a community of people who can share the experience of relocation and help one another. We aren't going to ever do things like cultural training or language training, right? Or house hunting, or a lot of the other services that a destination service company would help you go down the path. And so that's one clear difference I see in my mind. One of the other groups that we get associated a lot with is a lot of the tech platforms that have come out in the global mobility industry over the last couple of years. We kind of get lumped in that same bucket with them. And it's simply not the case, because the vast majority of them are coming out of digital marketplaces for services. And so they're helping, again, tackle a lot of the logistics of A to B and providing resources to you to be able to make that happen, or providing ways for you to get paid. We don't do any of that. We're not an app that does transactions. We're not an app that sells services. We're an app that connects people. We're an app that helps people help one another and in a community fashion. So, we very much, I think, in many ways can complement those other services, and can come in and either come in and help at the front end. I see, Jessica, your comment there about helping people with pre-decision. There's an opportunity to help in that space, and just to help facilitate some conversations around what is important to you, and then how can we then leverage that into building a community and so forth. There's the opportunity to help people just to kind of help manage some of the expectations and the highs and lows of getting from A to B, because we all know that, especially right now with how crazy logistics still are, some of those timeframes can be really crazy. Some of the expectations can just be blown up in a second. Yeah. And so there's great opportunities for community support there. But certainly that whole living life in a new place is really where our focus is. And that's where I think we have the best chance to complement a lot of the existing services and providers that are out there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, kind of piggyback off of your response to Jessica, I think, one of the other things that, a service like ours helps people do, particularly pre-decision, is also on the talent acquisition side. As candidates are, reviewing job opportunities, maybe they are going to have to move, providing them information proactively about where they might be going, giving them a tool to connect with people in advance so they can really learn about that place. Get themselves comfortable with the idea of, moving to Leavenworth, Washington, or wherever you may be going for that new job, is really important in just getting them comfortable to make that decision and ultimately decide to move. So the pre-decision aspect is a huge part of what we're doing here as well. And that goes to managing expectations and everything else. One other thing, Chris, and then we can move into, some of the return on investment that we see when you really focus on social well-being for your employees. There are other social media platforms out there. Obviously there's the Facebooks of the world, but there are smaller ones as well, Snapchat, TikTok, those types of things. Curious, how do we differentiate ourselves from those other social media platforms?
Well, in a couple of different ways. I would say, first of all, we're really we're building a niche universe of users, and the user base are people that are verified corporate relocated experiences, right? People who are actually going through that and can legitimately speak to what that's like. And makes me think of, Facebook, for example, where Facebook has everybody and anybody. And while they have things like groups that can help start to get you to the right community of people, those groups oftentimes get muddied with other people that are coming in to sell services or coming in and just creating noise or, any other things. So it's the ability to kind of help kind of clear out all of that added stuff that can dilute the value of that community. And then we also, our focus is on not having ads or solicitations in our application too. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, a really big differentiator in what we do. And that's why also we look at ourselves as an enterprise application. It is a benefit as part of the overall attraction and retention strategy for companies. Mm-hmm. And so that gives us the ability to stay away from the whole ad space. I think then the other thing is that we've got the opportunity to also provide very focused moderation tools, content in the application that we know is going to be meaningful to people and is going to be able to help foster the right kind of connections, to help foster the right kind of community, both in and outside of our application. And certainly, then weaving in the whole wellness and timely support relative to where you are in your journey.
Yeah.
And those are really hard things to do when you look at the vast majority of other tools that are out there that people try to use. Like we've heard people try to use dating apps to connect with people. We've heard people use more traditional things like Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, so forth. And they all have like some potential, but because that's not what the product is specifically designed for, it often leaves people in a place of, not meeting their needs.
Yeah, and something that reminds me of at the end of the day with other social media platforms, we are the product, right? And where they're
Yeah.
generating revenue is through our eyeballs. Where on our end, our goal is really to foster this community and let people make those connections, get that information, improve their mindset on the app, and then take it off the app. We want you to meet people in real life as well, and that's part of what we're doing here. Whereas other social media platforms, they really just want to keep you inside their ecosystem. So that makes a lot of sense. So last thing here, and then we can get into a brief demo, and then answer any questions that our listeners may have. What sort of return on investment can you expect if you address social well-being for your employees? How is that going to impact your bottom line? We know that it causes turnover. We know that has cost in and of itself. So, how do we measure and how do we look at the value of delivering the support for your employees?
Sure. So when we look at this, we by and large have been looking at retention because that's probably one of the easiest things to be able to measure right now. And since we know that there's upwards of a third of people in an average program that could be leaving right now, we feel pretty confident that by building in the right social support for people, that we could help a company save upwards of 15 to 20% on those retention, on that gap, that 1/3 gap, right? So right there alone, when you look at just an ROI, we're easily saving an average mobility program upwards of providing an upwards of 400% return on investment right there. Now there's a lot of factors that go into that, right? Not everybody has the same benefits. Not everybody has the same cost structures when it comes to relocation. But if you just look at, average numbers, average spend, that's where we typically land, is somewhere around that 400%. That doesn't factor in other things like productivity gains. I mean, we know that there's a huge productivity challenge when you're starting a new job, let alone a new job in a completely new place. And so we feel pretty confident that we can also help in other areas like that, and companies will see gains there as well. So that's kind of one of the areas that we're measuring ROI. But the other thing too is there is a very, I would say, light understanding of what the overall experience is in the industry at large for people from settling in onward. And so what we're also trying to do is to provide a lot of transparency into what do people actually experience, and what are the new programs or benefits that we could be pursuing to help those people. And so we're seeing a great opportunity to be a consultative partner back to our relocation partners and the corporations that we support, and helping to give them tangible data that speaks to needs that they could be meeting. And so there's a lot there that we could unpack and continue to evolve with organizations. And that may also mean maybe it's a renewed investment in an existing service. Maybe it is a change in a policy, to be determined, but that's one of the other big areas that we see opportunity.
Yeah, and we could probably have a whole webinar on the data opportunity here, when it comes to being able to get interesting insights into your mobility program, make improvements, understand your assignees' experiences. So we won't spend too much time on that. But I guess lastly, what sort of reporting, what sort of metrics are we going to be providing our clients, right off the bat that's going to be valuable for them? And where do you envision that going down the line?
Sure. So I think it's always important whenever we've had this conversation. I always start with saying, our focus is never going to be unveiling that individual's activity and what they're doing. Our focus is always helping you to look at more the kind of what you would expect from a more statistical approach, of saying at a program level, at a community level, at a regional level, and looking at those kinds of reporting opportunities to say, people in this area or people in this experience or this family scenario. We're seeing that they're struggling with these kinds of things. We're seeing the timing of these kinds of things happening. And so it's providing those kinds of insights and then being able to also give you the ability to then take that and do something with it. Because if I know, everybody in my program who has a family is struggling at 3 months in, and these are kind of the key themes that we're seeing, that gives me some really cool information to be able to act on and to go back and do something really cool with. It also, I think, positions mobility professionals to also continue to demonstrate the value that we have in the broader HR conversation. So that's the kind of reporting that we're going to be looking at doing and delivering. Certainly, as with any other application, engagement metrics and those kinds of typical things will certainly be included as well. But I think the broader value is thinking more about the experiential data that exists there.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I do want to address 2 comments here that we just got before we move into the demo. So just quickly, Jack, when it comes to us being a low-cost product, and of course, not only marketing our return on investment. Yes, you're absolutely right. Pivt licenses, under $200 a year. And that also includes the employee's spouse or partner. We kind of alluded to this earlier, but we do view them as a package. If your spouse or partner is not happy, if they're not successful in that relocation, that's going to directly impact your employees' productivity and ultimately your retention rates. So we do view that as a package, and it is incredibly low cost. Happy to discuss that on a case-by-case basis. So feel free to reach out after this webinar, and happy to provide you more information there. And then Kelsey, when it comes to all of the different applications, all of the different services that employees get throughout their relocation process, Chris, I think this is a good question to pass on to you. How are we planning on cutting through the noise? And I think part of this is, we touched on this earlier, that pre-decision aspect as well of where you get Pivt and when it's put in front of you. So I'll leave that one to you.
I think a lot of it goes back to the differentiation of why you would use Pivt, right? When you look at a lot of the other platforms of technology that exist there to support people, they're usually focused on some kind of a transaction. So one example would be, this is how I've used this tool to get reimbursed, or I have to use this tool to be able to pay for a COD, or whatever that transaction might be. So a lot of them focus on things like that. A lot of them focus on also selecting services or signing up for services. And so we're not doing that. And so when you look at just that nature, that changes the interaction model quite considerably. I think it also changes the life cycle and the perceived value for a user. The other thing too is we see there being the potential for a lot higher use, at least initially, from the spouse side of things, because very often they're not the ones that are using the technology products that are available in the market today. And so it may be that initially we have more of a spouse community that then starts to integrate the other spouse that was the one that's the employee that was moved. So I think that's how you're going to start to see some of that. Some of it is also just making sure that we're clearly articulating that in an email to onboard somebody. So those are kind of some of the ways, Kelsey, specifically that we're tackling that issue.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to add there is, Pivt, it's of course an application, focused on generating and helping people create these communities, get access to experts, really, focus their mindset. It's also an ecosystem of content and relationships that you build. And so there's information that you can get inside and outside the Pivt app, Zoom cohorts where we'll assign folks moving to the same area around the same time to each other. And so it's not just exclusively in the application. That said, getting in front of assignees when they find out about that move, pre-decision, that's an integral part in making sure that Pivt is a fulfilling part of their relocation experience. And then Mark, I want to address that quickly, and then we can move into a short demo. How do we encourage employees and their spouse partners to engage with your team if they are hesitant in logging on? So there's a couple of things. So we noted first, in terms of privacy policy, we have a community guidelines that everyone joins and agrees to when they join the application. You can view that online as well at pivtapp.com. So feel free to take a look. But we're not providing granular level information back to employers in any situation. We're not providing, we're not selling our data to third parties. So actions you're taking on Pivt, they're your own actions. And yes, this is a benefit from your employer, but there's no big brother watching over you. That said, we have moderation tools in place. There's no discussion of service providers on the application, all of this stuff that really helps foster specific conversations in the direction we want them to go. We also have these engagement campaigns that are email campaigns, Zoom cohorts, all of these different sort of ways to get in front of people outside of just, hey, here's the application, download it. So we've kind of created different funnels to bring people into the application through content and all of that. And then, have put tools in place to make sure they're comfortable using it and things don't go off the rails.
And John, maybe one last thing I'd add to that, specifically, Mark, to your point. The introduction to Pivt is also typically coming from a trusted source. So if you look at the employee, we often find that our corporate clients as well as our relocation partners are both engaged in setting up the invitation to be able to help encourage participation in the platform. And then when you think about the spouse, the way spouses get onto our platform are because they're actually invited by their spouse who's the employee. So they're being invited through somebody who they should be trusting, the most out of anybody. So we looked at specifically what are some of those ways that we could leverage the trusted ecosystem of people that exists already to be able to introduce this in a way that will help people feel comfortable with it. And it's not a platform for employers necessarily to be on there engaging with. And so you're not going to find employers, in there and interacting with you on the feeds or, digging into your conversations. This is a platform for the employee to meet other people, for their spouse to meet other people, and to be able to do so in a safe environment.
Absolutely. So I'll give me a second, and I am going to be sharing our live demo environment from my phone onto my computer, and then from my computer onto our live webinar. So lots of potential points of failure. And then, if anyone has additional questions on what we've discussed here, please feel free to reach out at any point. Chris and I, both active on LinkedIn, happy to, answer any questions there. And, you can reach us at our first name, last name at pivtapp.com. As well via email. So we're more than happy to be an open book, answer any specific questions. Understand, obviously, we can't get to everything in a single webinar. I'm sure we will be doing more down the line as well. So I'm sharing my screen now. Let's see if we can add that to the stream. There we go. Great. So we're just going to do a quick, high-level overview of the application here. Starting on the profile page, the reason I like to start here, this is the first interaction our users are going to have with Pivt as they create their account. So, where are you moving to and from? What does your family look like? What are your interests? Where did you go to school? Where have you lived in the past? What are the causes that you care about? The environment, animals, whatever it is. As you provide this information to Pivt, we can then actually use this to connect you to other users throughout the application. So a basic example, and you guys can see, I actually moved here from New York to Chicago, but hey, John, by the way, there's 4 other people that have recently moved from New York to Chicago. They happen to have cats. One of them actually recently found a vet. Maybe you should connect to them. So that's just an example of the type of connections that we're going to be fostering on the application based off of the information that you provide us. The more information we have, the better we can connect you to people that are relevant, to your experience. And that again goes to languages, where you've lived, your interests, etc. As I noted earlier, you can also invite your partner and spouse through the onboarding process, and then throughout your profile, we have a button right there for it. Quickly, your timeline. This is just recent, posts that you've made on the application. So I had created this pivot hour yesterday for a demo, this happy hour for a demo. So you'll find that here in my timeline. It'll also be one of my events. And because I noted that I'm attending, it also happens to be one of my saved items. The saved items is also neat. As you come across important things in the application that are relevant to you, you can bookmark them and add them to your profile. That way you can reference things that you have already seen and directly access them right from there. Moving over to your home screen, this is the central area on the application where you're going to see hashtags that are trending, posts from users that you follow, from communities that you're a part of, posts from experts in the area as well. So you can see, Tony as an example, is posting about, and there's a slight delay, but it'll come up, home prices jumping in Dallas, Fort Worth. That's actually something very common that we've been seeing talked about on Pivt, in Austin in particular. Dallas is another area, but even parts of Florida, Chicago, New York. And so you'll see this type of content like that as well throughout the application, right from your home screen. Just to note as well on the connections front, and again, there's a slight delay here, sorry. This is where you can, find people in your network. You can filter it down to people that are relevant to you. And we're actually going to push recommendations to you. So, in this case, John Steve has a lot of similarities in terms of his interests, when he moved, his age, the age of his kids, whatever that might be, we recommend you follow him. Or we'll send you a push notification, say, hey, John Steve recently just moved to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Maybe you should reach out to him. So again, it all ties back to creating that community, and all of the information we gather that you share with us is used to really spark those conversations, generate a sense of camaraderie with folks on the application, direct them to resources, and really give them access to a community that they wouldn't have otherwise, or they'd have to really strike out on their own to get. A couple of other things to note. We have these communities here. We also have private communities as an option. We've noticed a lot of our corporate clients are interested in having these private communities where they can, essentially have a centralized location on Pivt where all of their assignees, their spouses, can access company-specific information. This can be managed by your HR team. You can create your own guidelines. We'll provide you moderation tools so you can manage the specific conversations from a corporate side. And then you can provide resources. So, PDFs, links to videos, other types of content that are important for your assignees, all in these private communities. So that's a great opportunity for folks to really centralize the community building and the information gathering for their specific assignees in an area. And we found that's a really popular option for a lot of our corporate clients. Last couple of things I'll show you here. And then, of course, if anyone's looking for a longer demo, I know we are running out of time here. Happy to spend 15, 20, 30 minutes walking you through everything specifically. A search feature as an example, excuse me. My computer froze there. Search feature as an example. So if you're looking for something specific, you can type in a dentist as an example. I'm looking for a dentist for my kid. I type that in. Any dentist related post is going to pop up. So again, we really want to feed you exactly what you're looking for, the people that you're looking for at the right times based off of your interests. And you can do that through these search features, filters on our network, and everything else. And then the last thing that's really important just for any application like this, a direct messaging feature, being able to, directly interact with our users, in group messages, direct messages. You can reach out to each other, and you can note, Matt Sasso, our chief product officer, our last conversation was about him reading poetry. So I am blowing him up on that front. So that's it for today. We'll leave the deeper demos for another time, given we are running out of time on this webinar. Feel free to reach out with any specific questions. If you have any questions for these last couple of minutes, you can also just comment here, and we can definitely address them. And we look forward to hearing from you folks, as we continue to expand and after our launch on March 1st.